Anyone in search of a good mystery needs only to do a quick internet search to find thousands of cases that continue to baffle investigators. In some instances, these cases remain open due to a lack of evidence or witnesses, and it's only decades later that a clue is found, or advances in forensic technology make it possible to bring the person responsible to justice. Number 10. It took 28 years for 51-year-old Joe McCaleb's attacker to be identified, and when all was said and done, his case told the tale of an unthinkable betrayal at the hands of the woman who claimed to love him. In 1985, Joe was living in Houston, Texas with his second wife, Carolyn Sue Krizan Wilson, and by all accounts they had a very happy marriage. But Joe had already lived through an unthinkable tragedy, the passing of his and his first wife's daughter, which had been such a strain on their marriage that they eventually decided to get divorced after being together for 22 years. Joe and Carolyn met each other at their mutual workplace, which was at the Brown and Root Construction Company, and after dating for a few weeks they decided to move in together, and in 1984 they got married. Then on the 22nd of September the next year, Carolyn made a frantic call to the police, stating that a man had broken into their home and attacked Joe while he was asleep in bed. When investigators arrived at the scene, she told them that the man managed to get a hold of her firearm and then he used it to attack Joe, who was rushed to a nearby hospital. He would not survive, and at first the police could find no reason not to believe Carolyn's version of events. But Joe's family started to suspect that the case wasn't as simple as she would have them believe. She now claimed that a week before the attack, a man had entered her car while she was driving and assaulted her, but she chose not to tell Joe about it. This was, according to her, the same man who'd ended Joe's life, and she added that she managed to wound him as he fled. It would come to light that she'd been married 7 times, and that she was still married to her previous husband when she and Joe tied the knot. She was charged with bigamy, but Joe's case saw no further developments, and eventually it went cold. Then, in 2008, the decision was made to re-examine the case, and evidence was found that linked Carolyn to the attack. But by this time, she was suffering from pre-dementia and claimed to have no memory of that night. The judge overseeing the trial threw the case out of court, and it seemed as though nothing further could be done. 5 years later, though, a judge ordered that the trial should go ahead, and Carolyn agreed to a plea deal. She confessed that she was the one who ended Joe's life, and that she'd done so to cash in on 2 life insurance policies that were opened in his name. Joe's daughter was delighted at receiving the news that her father's murderer would finally face the justice she deserved, but her joy was short-lived. As part of the plea deal, which took into account the fact that Carolyn was now 71 years old and suffering from dementia, she could only serve a 6-month stint in prison, after which she'd be free to live her life once more. Number 9. In October of 1979, 24-year-old Susan Schwarz was living in Linwood, Washington, and those who knew her well describe her as being full of life, vibrant, and someone who had a bright future ahead of her. But on the 22nd of October that year, her life was cut short, and for decades, no one would be arrested for the crime. On that day, she was found deceased in her apartment, having been tied up and attacked with a firearm. The crime scene held very little evidence, and no witnesses came forward with any useful information. No fingerprints were found. There were no signs of forced entry into the apartment, and it was suspected that she was a victim of a robbery that had gone wrong. Susan's family was desperate for answers, but despite the best efforts of investigators to identify a suspect, the case went cold, and it seemed as though Susan's killer would get away with their heinous deed. It would later come to light that Susan was a high school friend of the estranged wife of a man named Gregory Johnson. The woman confided in Susan that he'd been physically abusive towards her and that she feared for the safety of her young son. Susan decided to help her in any way that she could, and so the woman and her son were moved to a shelter until she could find a way to leave the state for good. This sent Johnson into a rage, and while it was suspected that he may have been responsible for the attack, no evidence was found that could prove this theory. He was questioned twice, first telling investigators that he'd been fishing in Edmonds on the day that Susan's life was ended. There was no way to confirm whether or not this was true, and 7 years later, when he was questioned again, he changed his story and stated that his brother was the one responsible. Still, there was no evidence to charge either of the brothers, and for the next few years, nothing further could be done. That would all change in 2010 when the case was re-examined once more, and a pack of cards was released that contained the photos of victims of cold cases. Suzanne's photo was featured on the Queen of Hearts, and the decks were distributed amongst inmates in case they jogged someone's memory. Finally, a breakthrough was made when one inmate asked to speak to investigators about Susan's case. He stated that at some point, he'd spoken to Johnson, who openly admitted that he'd ended Susan's life in revenge for meddling in his relationship with his estranged wife. Looking deeper into his life, they identified his then-girlfriend, and she was questioned. She confessed that she was there on the night of the attack, and that Johnson had grabbed Susan when she stepped out of the shower before tying her up and ending her life with a firearm. He then told her that if she told anyone about what had happened, she would also be sent to prison, so she remained silent for decades. Even after they split up, he would occasionally call her to remind her that he knew where her family lived and that they would pay the price if she spoke to the police. Johnson was finally arrested, and he confessed to ending Susan's life. He was now 58 years old and had already spent some time in prison for robbery. He was sentenced to 24 years in prison, and Suzanne's family finally had the answers that they'd been searching for nearly 3 decades. Number 8. When 22-year-old Matthew Chase suddenly disappeared in Los Angeles, California, detectives immediately suspected that he may have been abducted by persons unknown. But as the case progressed, it became clear that something even more sinister had occurred. On the 8th of June, 1988, Matthew went out to dinner with his roommate, Teresa Dahl. They returned to their apartment at around 11:45 p.m., but Matthew then suddenly remembered that he hadn't deposited his latest paycheck. He asked if he could use Teresa's car, and she agreed, asking him to pick up some cat food while he was out. She knew that he'd only be gone for about 15 minutes, since he planned to deposit his check at an ATM and get cat food from a nearby store, and she trusted him since they'd been friends since childhood. But he never returned, and she started to become worried. Matthew was eventually reported missing, and during the resulting investigation, some disturbing details started to emerge about what happened to him that night. It was discovered that his bank card had been used several times that night after depositing his paycheck. First, he withdrew some money while still at the ATM, but he then returned 30 minutes later and attempted to withdraw a further $280, but this was more than he was allowed to withdraw per day. This led investigators to believe he was either being forced to withdraw money or that someone was using his card, since he likely would have known the daily withdrawal limit on his card. Later that night, 2 more attempts were made to withdraw money. First $200, and a minute later $100, but both transactions were declined. 11 minutes later, another attempt was made at a different branch with the same result. But this provided the first clue in Matt's case. A camera at the last ATM captured images of a man standing too close to him while he attempted to withdraw the money. Over the course of the next few days, several more attempts were made, and when Matt's paycheck finally cleared, $400 was withdrawn, after which his card was withheld by the ATM, since Teresa and her brother Steve had frozen his account. Teresa's car was eventually found close to the first bank branch, and when it was searched, it was found to have been wiped clean of fingerprints, but a blue bandana was found inside, which didn't belong to Matt or Teresa. Unfortunately, Matt's remains were found in a ravine in Pasadena on the 17th of September, 1988. He was identified by his dental records, and it was determined his life had been ended with a firearm, but no suspects were identified, and the case went cold. For reasons that have not been disclosed, investigators decided to question the girlfriend of a gangster named David Meza in 2018. She identified him as the man in the ATM photos and revealed that when he was 27, he lost his life in a gang-related incident just 1 day after he'd ended Matt's life. It's believed that Meza had at least one accomplice in the crime, but they've never been identified, and it's unlikely that they ever will be. The case had finally been solved, and Matt's family and friends found some closure, but the fact that Meza never faced the consequences of his actions against Matt was a hard pill to swallow. Number 7. In January of 1999, 28-year-old Joyce Chang was working as a government lawyer. She was the only daughter in a Taiwanese-American family, and according to those close to her, she always remained very close with her loved ones. At the time, she was sharing an apartment in the DuPont Circle area of Washington with her brother, Roger, and they'd often go for coffee at their favorite Starbucks, which was located close by. On the 9th of January of that year, Joyce and a few of her friends went out for dinner and a movie, and at around 8:15 p.m., her friend Kathy offered her a ride home. But Joyce asked to be dropped off at the Starbucks where she planned to walk the 4 blocks to her apartment. When she didn't make it home that night, Roger informed the police, and since Joyce was a federal employee, the FBI started investigating her disappearance. A couple who'd been walking through Anacostia Park came forward to report that they'd found a billfold containing Joyce's credit card. Soon after, Joyce's apartment keys, jacket, and video rental card were found washed up on the banks of the Anacostia River. And the river was searched, but nothing was found. Then, 3 months later, a canoeist contacted the authorities after he came across a body in the river, and thanks to DNA testing, it was confirmed that it was Joyce who'd been found. It could not be determined how she lost her life, and her case was closed, with the cause of her passing listed as undetermined. It should be noted that just 3 days after Joyce disappeared, someone wrote a message on a wall near the Starbucks that read, quote, "Good day, JC. May I never miss the thrill of being near you." It was suspected that a serial killer may have been operating in the area, but no suspects were found. It's not been revealed what further evidence was found, but investigators were eventually able to link 2 men, Steve Allen and Neil Joachim, to Joyce's case. They were known criminals who operated in the DC area at the time, and it's believed that they abducted her with the aim of robbing her. But she managed to escape while on the banks of the river, but she slipped on the ice and was unable to make her way back to shore. One of the men was already in prison, where he was serving a life sentence, and the other is believed to be in Guyana. Quite unbelievably, neither was ever charged with Joyce's murder. Number 6. Some crime scenes provide investigators with a wealth of evidence that allows them to quickly and effectively figure out what happened and who's responsible. But in cases such as the one involving 40-year-old Adrienne Shel, a single clue is found that eventually brings it to a close. Adrienne was an artistic soul who had a passion for acting, writing, directing, and art. She was also a loving mother who was directing an indie film called Waitress in November of 2006. But she wouldn't live to see it screened at the Sundance Film Festival. On the 1st of November of that year, the police got a call and were informed that someone had been found deceased in an apartment in Manhattan, specifically Greenwich Village, where Andy Ostroy, Adrienne's husband, was waiting. He informed the officers that when he arrived at the apartment that Adrienne used as an office that day, he entered the bathroom, and there he found his wife deceased. It was determined that her life was ended earlier that day, and at first, investigators didn't suspect any foul play. But her family and friends vehemently disputed this and demanded that further investigation be done. Ostroy stated that he dropped her off at the apartment that morning at around 9:30 a.m., and he started to become concerned when he didn't hear from her for the rest of that day. He decided to leave work earlier than usual to check on her, and when he arrived, he was horrified to discover that she was no longer alive. No signs of forced entry were found. Everything seemed to be in place, and so it seemed as though there was no struggle that had taken place. One detective at the scene felt that something about the case was off, and before long he found a shoe print on the seat of the toilet. It was identified as being from a Reebok Allen Iverson sneaker, a size 8. This was much bigger than Adrienne's shoe size, and it also didn't match Ostroy's. Someone else had to have been in the apartment with her when she lost her life. Ostroy's alibi was checked, and it was indeed found that he was at work all day. Several people, including those working on Adrienne's film set, were questioned, and at one point, an aspiring writer was suspected, since he'd grown frustrated with Adrienne over her refusal to read one of his scripts. But when they attempted to question him, they discovered that he'd relocated to a different country before the crime was even committed. They then returned to the apartment and realized that construction was being carried out in an apartment on the floor below Adrienne's. When they entered that apartment, they found construction paper that was covered in dust, and in the dust, a shoe print that exactly matched the one found at the crime scene. The construction crew was questioned, and it was quickly determined that a man named Wilson Pilko was the foreman, but he wasn't at the site. They then traveled back to his house in Brooklyn, and when he opened the door, they immediately noticed a backpack sitting on the floor with a pair of matching sneakers visible. When asked about the sneakers, he stated that the backpack belonged to his 19-year-old brother, Diego. He was also in the house, and when he was questioned, he at first claimed to be innocent, but under interrogation at the police station, he confessed that he'd ended Adrienne's life. He stated that she'd come down to the apartment where he was working to complain about the noise. He took exception to her demeanor and slammed the door shut, but Adrienne opened it and, according to him, slapped him in the face. She then stated she was going to call the police, and being an illegal immigrant, Pilko knew he would be deported. He followed her back to her apartment, begging her to reconsider, but when she refused, he lost his temper and ended her life. But it was noted that there was no construction dust on Adrienne's shoes, and so she could not have gone down to the apartment where Pilko was working. He was caught in a lie. He was charged with first-degree manslaughter, and at his trial, he confessed that he first encountered Adrienne in the building's elevator. He made up his mind to rob her, and when he walked past her apartment, he spotted her purse through the open door. He intended to grab the purse and flee, but Adrienne saw him and threatened to call the police. This prompted him to take action and end her life. Pilko was sentenced to 25 years in prison, the result of his poor decision to steal property that belonged to someone else, resulting in several lives being ruined forever. Number 5. In 2003, detectives were able to solve 2 cold cases that occurred in Orange County years earlier, thanks to advancements in DNA technology. The first involved 23-year-old Shannon Rose Lloyd, who was described as being a tomboy with a love for horses. On the 21st of May, 1987, Shannon was found deceased in her apartment in Garden Grove. She was found in her bathroom, and it was determined she'd been assaulted before her life was ended. The second case involved 27-year-old Rene Cuevas, who was found deceased by the side of Lambert Road near the El Toro Marine Base in Irvine, California, on the 19th of February, 1989. It's not been revealed how she lost her life, but the authorities immediately started investigating the case as a homicide. DNA found at both crime scenes was sent for testing, in hopes that it would come back with a match to a suspect, but this was not the case. It was a frustrating situation where evidence was found, but it failed to help advance either of these cases. Despite their best efforts, investigators were unable to identify any suspects, and at first they had no way of knowing that the 2 cases were linked. But this would all change in 1998, when a man named Reuben Smith was arrested in Las Vegas. He had attempted to end a woman's life after assaulting her, but she managed to escape and alert the police. She later stated that when she encountered Smith that day, she immediately felt that he was evil. As soon as he started attacking her, she knew that she would lose her life if she didn't fight back. She barely managed to escape, and when she contacted the police, Smith was taken into custody. He was then forced to submit a DNA sample, which was submitted to a lab for testing. And at this point, Smith must have known that he was in serious trouble with the law, and that there was nothing he could do about it since he was already in custody. Nevertheless, he had no choice but to wait in jail until the results of the DNA samples were returned. As soon as this was done, it was discovered that Smith was present at both Shannon and Rene's crime scenes, and that he was the one responsible for ending their lives. It's not been revealed how Smith chose his victims, or whether his crimes were merely carried out opportunistically, but there was no doubt that he was the culprit. But he would never face the consequences of his actions, as he passed away in 1999. Number 4. The remaining family of 68-year-old Leila Johnson, who lost her life to homicide in 1976, believed that her case would never be solved, since by 2023 no suspects had been arrested, and it seemed as though her attacker would get away with their heinous crime. Leila's granddaughter, Leslie Sullinger, stated that the question of who had ended her grandmother's life always gnawed at her, and the family always wondered if justice would one day be served. The case started on the 14th of May, 1976, when Leila was found deceased by one of her neighbors inside the duplex in Oklahoma City where she lived. The neighbor immediately contacted the police, but when they arrived, they found that she'd been deceased for some time. As happens with so many cases, DNA evidence was collected at the scene, but since that technology was still relatively unknown at the time, there was no way to identify a suspect, and before long, Leila's case went cold. All that was known was that Leila lived alone in the duplex, and it was assumed that someone had forced their way into her home before assaulting her and ending her life to eliminate her as a witness. Although investigators would not have known it at the time, some of the evidence collected from the scene contained some of the culprit's DNA, and many years later, it would lead to him being identified. In 2004, almost 5 decades after the crime was committed, the case was re-examined, and the DNA that was collected all those years ago was sent for analysis, but it could not be matched to anyone in the national database. For the next few years, nothing more could be done, but in the years that followed, millions of people started submitting their DNA to the database thanks to home DNA tests. This meant that any sample could be compared to those millions of samples, and as a result, many cold cases are now being solved. Even if an exact match isn't found, genealogy can then be used to create a family tree, and very often, this leads to the person responsible for the crime finally being tracked down. This is exactly what happened years later in Leila's case. On several occasions, investigators believed they were close to finding Leila's attacker, but at first they struggled to find a familial connection to her attacker's DNA. They persisted, though, and eventually it was discovered that Charles O'Droke's DNA was present at the scene, and finally they had a suspect. For reasons unknown, Droke decided to break into Leila's home that day, and as a result, she lost her life. It isn't known whether his intention was to commit a robbery, or if he had a more nefarious motive, but it was now certain that he was guilty. Since 27 years had passed since the attack, it came as no surprise that Droke was no longer alive. It would come to light in 1989, when Droke was 40 years old. His brother had just been released from prison, and while no details on the incident are available, it is known that his brother ended his life. DNA Labs International was able to create a family tree of the attacker using his DNA, and a year later, the search was narrowed to the point where Droke was identified as the only suspect. Leila's was the first ever case to be solved in this manner by the Oklahoma City Police Department, but it's very unlikely it'll be the last. Number 3. Many people are not too fond of Valentine's Day, since they feel it puts a lot of pressure on them to find the perfect gift for their partner. It was with this in mind that a man decided to rob 23-year-old Angela Perkins on the 24th of February, 1994. But the robbery went horribly wrong. On that day, Angela was driving her car, a Mazda RX-7, in Memphis, Tennessee. And at one point, she stopped at a stop sign at Spotswood and Mendenhall Roads. This is when 2 men decided to strike. They approached Angela's car with weapons drawn, but she refused to obey their commands, and instead decided to try and flee. She stepped on the gas, but one of the men opened fire and struck her. She was badly injured, and she managed to bring her car to a stop before dialing 911. But she was unable to provide the operator with her exact location, hence it was impossible to trace her location, and it would only be 2 hours later that a police officer came across the scene. Angela had somehow managed to make it out of the vehicle, as she was found lying on the pavement close to the vehicle, but she had passed away. No usable evidence was found at the scene, and no witnesses came forward with any information on the attack, so Angela's case quickly went cold. For the next 20 years, detectives would look into the case now and then, but it seemed utterly unsolvable. No leads had been received in the time that had passed, and it seemed as though Angela was merely in the wrong place at the wrong time, and this was a crime of opportunity. This was later confirmed when an inmate in a Texas prison stated he knew who had committed the crime and that he was ready to tell investigators what he knew. He pointed the finger at Fonse Fanevong, who at the time was known as Kapu. He added that while he was still part of the robbery attempt, Kapu was the one who pulled the trigger that day, and he knew Kapu was guilty since he'd bragged about the crime being featured in a newspaper, stating he'd finally made the news. Initially, Kapu denied any involvement and claimed that he was with friends at the time when the attack took place, but he eventually decided to come clean and admitted that he'd planned to steal Angela's car stereo so that he could buy a Valentine's Day gift for his girlfriend. At his trial, Kapu's defense attorneys asked that the prisoner's testimony be disregarded, since he was serving time in prison for murder, and hence his word could not be trusted. But it was quickly determined that there was probable cause for the trial to continue, and Vonevong was charged with first-degree murder in the perpetration of an attempted robbery. The prisoner stated that he was asleep in his apartment in Memphis when he was awoken by Kapu and another man called T. They seemed panicked and told him that they had to leave town immediately since Kapu had ended someone's life. The trio then drove to Murfreesboro, where they got rid of the weapon, but they quickly returned to Memphis when Kapu's girlfriend called him and stated she was angry that he didn't spend Valentine's Day with her and that he hadn't bought her a gift. He added that he failed to come forward with this information out of fear of retaliation by Kapu and the gang that he belonged to. But years later, he went through what he called a spiritual change, and realizing that he might receive a reward, decided to contact the police with what he knew. Kapu was sentenced to 30 years in prison, and he'll be eligible for parole after serving 30% of that time. Number 2. 40-year-old Virginia Freeman was a real estate agent in College Station, Texas in 1981, where she lived with her husband Charles and the rest of the family. Virginia, who was known to her friends and family as Ginger, was by all accounts a bubbly person who had a lot of friends and was well liked by most people she met. She'd carved a successful career for herself in the realty industry, and the 1st of December 1981 seemed like any other day, as her office received a call from a man who stated that he wanted to view a ranch on Greens Prairie Road, a rural part of College Station. He added that he was interested in purchasing the property, and later that day, Virginia traveled to the ranch to meet him and to show him around. The person who spoke to him on the phone stated he had a country-sounding accent. The man made sure to mention that he was looking for a property away from the busy town center, and that he had $73,000 to spend. All of the real estate agents working at the agency were female, and about 30 minutes after the call was received, Virginia drove out to the ranch alone to meet with him. When Charles got home that afternoon, he was surprised to find that Virginia wasn't there, and he became concerned. He reported her absence to the police and then drove out to the ranch, where he found her deceased. She'd been attacked with a sharpened blade, and when the scene was processed, it was found that she'd fought back bravely against her attacker, since she had defensive wounds on her hands. In hopes that the attacker had left some of his biological material behind, her fingernails were scraped, and the tissue that was collected was preserved. Charles was questioned extensively, but it was found that their marriage was a happy one, and that he'd been at work when Virginia's life was ended. A man who worked as a brick mason in the area at the time came forward to report that he'd driven past the scene of the crime that day, and that he saw a man standing next to his car, which was parked in front of Virginia's vehicle. He was placed under hypnosis and was able to recall enough details for a forensic sketch of the suspect to be created. Unfortunately, though, this and the man's memory of a partial license plate didn't lead anywhere, and for 2 years, nothing more could be done. Then, 2 years after the attack, a man named Henry Lee Lucas was found guilty of ending the life of a woman in Ringgold, Texas, and he was being led out of the courtroom and yelled that he'd ended the lives of many more women. This prompted further investigation, and it was discovered that he was in the area when Virginia was attacked. Lucas was questioned again and was shown a photo of Virginia, after which he confessed that he had indeed ended her life. But it was discovered this was merely a ploy to buy himself some time, since he was now being held on death row. In 1997, DNA technology was used to take another look at the case, and it was discovered that James Otto Earhart had been working as a repairman in the area at the time, and that he was also being held on death row for murder. In 2018, DNA testing indicated that Earhart was likely responsible for the attack on Virginia. But Earhart had already been executed for his crime, and hence his DNA had to be collected only after his remains were exhumed. This was done, and at last, it was revealed he was the one who ended Virginia's life that day. Number 1. When 57-year-old Virginia Vincent was attacked and her life was ended in 1985, her neighbors were shocked that such a horrific crime had been committed in their neighborhood. And as investigators struggled to solve the case, they lived in fear that another attack would take place in the area. Virginia had been living in Danville, in Contra Costa County for 6 years by September of that year, and she was employed as a real estate agent. When her family was unable to get in touch with her, they traveled to her Danville Court apartment home, and there they were dismayed to find she'd been tied up and was no longer alive. The police immediately raced to the scene, and there they found a thin white belt around her neck and a pair of stockings lying next to her body. They also found 2 open bottles of beer and a bottle of hard liquor, some of which had been poured into a glass that had been left on the floor. They also found it strange that the apartment's front door was found open, and noted that the television was left on. This made little sense to her family, who told investigators that Virginia never drank beer and she always kept her house in immaculate condition. Hence, she would have never left open bottles and glasses on her floor. Some biological material was collected from the scene, but for the next 17 years, Virginia's case stalled as no further evidence was found. A DNA profile was created using that evidence in 2002, and at last some progress was being made. But this did not lead investigators to a suspect, and once again the case went cold. It was only in 2017 that investigators decided to create a familial search to try and identify a suspect. The FBI had also conducted an investigation and suggested that Virginia knew her attacker since no signs of forced entry were found in her apartment. At one point, it was suggested that the serial killer, Joseph Nasso, was responsible, or that Virginia was one of the Golden State Killer's victims, but this theory was later dismissed when it was determined that the circumstances of the attack on Virginia didn't fit. Thanks to the familial search that was then carried out, a man called Joey Lynn Ford was positively identified as the man who had ended Virginia's life, and a warrant for his arrest was issued. But it would then come to light that he'd passed away in 1997, 12 years after the attack, when he was aged 36. His remains were exhumed, and after DNA was collected, it was positively matched to the DNA found under Virginia's fingernails. Investigators looked for evidence that Ford and Virginia knew each other, but none was ever found, and the motive for the attack remains unknown. Virginia's family thanked everyone involved for finally solving her case, and stated that they'd finally found at least some type of closure, even if Ford would never be made to repay for his crime. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knott, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.